Okay, I'll go ahead and introduce our leaders today. We have Julia Buck and Dana Hawley with us today, leading a conversation about social distancing in the animal kingdom. Julia is in biology and marine biology at UNC Wilmington. Her research in disease ecology investigates population, community, and ecosystem level consequences of parasites, and especially in coastal systems. Her research interests are quite broad. They include biodiversity, disease relationships, and also the indirect effects of parasites in ecosystems. Dana Hawley is in biological sciences at Virginia Tech. Her research focuses on the ecology and evolution of host susceptibility, pathogen virulence, and disease transmission. And I personally know a lot about her work on social behavior in disease, but she works on a variety of different topics and different systems. I'll just say one last thing. I was inspired to invite them to participate because of the nice piece that they wrote in the conversation, which is, I don't really know how to describe the conversation. It's like a blog, academic blog place. And I was so excited when I saw that, that posting with, I think, this picture on it. Wasn't it this picture that you have on your slides? And so I'll just mention that a lot of people on this in Club EvMed are very interested in public outreach and communication to the public. So you may want to try to work in some of that as well, or you may get some questions about that and about the conversation. Okay, I'll turn it over to you guys.
All right, welcome everybody, and thank you for the invitation. So today we're going to be talking about social distancing in the animal kingdom. So about 20 years ago or so, ecologists had a revelation. The revelation was this: predators affect their prey not just by killing them, that is a consumptive effect, but also by scaring them. We call that a non-consumptive effect. So the classic example of this comes from Yellowstone. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in the 1990s, they killed a bunch of elk. That's not surprising. But they also scared the elk and changed the elk's behavior so that elk occupy different areas of the park now in the presence of the wolves than they did in the absence of the wolves. So that's a non-consumptive effect, a non-lethal effect of a consumer on its victim due to the perceived predation risk. And so a couple of years ago, colleagues and I took this idea and we applied it to parasites. It turns out that just like predators, parasites can alter the behavior of their hosts without even consuming or infecting them. So just as prey alter the behavior, alter their behavior to avoid predators, hosts alter their behavior to avoid parasites. So in 2010, Landre proposed the landscape of fear to describe these non-consumptive effects. Basically, this is a three-dimensional landscape whose peaks and valleys are defined by the relative levels of predation risk that are perceived by an individual prey. In 2018, colleagues Weinstein et al. And I published this paper in Science called The Landscape of Disgust. And this is an analogous concept. It's shown here in red. Basically, the landscape of disgust has peaks and valleys that are defined by the relative levels of infection risk perceived by an individual host. So the hosts are avoiding parasites. How are they doing that? Well, Curtis, the paper that was sent around, if you happen to have read it, in 2014 proposed 4 different strategies that humans and other animals use to avoid parasites. So the first one is, if the parasite or an organism that vectors parasites like a mosquito is detectable, if it's large enough to actually be detected, then it's possible to avoid it directly. For example, if there were lots and lots of ticks in a particular area of your yard, you might avoid going there. An example in animals, non-human animals, is tadpoles that turns out trematode cercaria that infect tadpoles are quite large as infective stages go. They're almost microscopic, but not quite. But the tadpoles can detect them directly, and when they do detect that, they have a burst of speed that moves them away from that trematode cercaria that would otherwise burrow into their skin. So if you can detect an infective stage, you can avoid it directly. But a lot of infective stages are far too small to be detected directly. And in this case, humans and animals avoid objects and situations of infection risk. For example, humans avoid feces. Think about the last time you changed a dirty diaper. You felt the emotion disgust because throughout evolutionary history, feces contained parasites. Even if they don't now, you're still going to feel that emotion because you evolved to feel that emotion. And animals do this too. There's plenty of studies showing that ungulates avoid foraging near feces, for example. Another object of likely to make you sick is carcasses. We also feel disgust usually in the presence of carcasses. And some animals even avoid carcasses as well. For a scavenger, a carcass would generally represent a free meal. And so it would make sense for the scavenger to eat it. But it turns out that sometimes they avoid it anyway. A study published in 2017 showed that carnivores avoid scavenging on closely related species, those that are most likely, those from whom they are most likely to get sick. A third strategy that we can use to avoid parasites is to alter our niche or our environment. For example, malaria used to exist in the US, but it doesn't anymore because we've modified our niche or environment by draining swamps and spraying pesticides and so on and so forth, so that they're no longer suitable for the parasite. And animals do this too. This is the dusky-footed wood rat, and it brings bay leaves into its nest because they repel fleas. So altering the niche to discourage parasites is a good infection avoidance strategy. And then the last strategy that we'll talk about is avoidance of conspecifics, and especially those that show signs of infection. For example, between these two people, who's sick, the person on the left or the person on the right? I'll give you a second to make a choice. So when I tried this exercise on my disease ecology students this term, 95% of them correctly identified the person on the left as being sick. So in this case, we are using very subtle visual cues to tell us who's sick and then to stay away from them. And non-human animals do this as well. This is a spiny lobster. Spiny lobsters are generally gregarious. They hang out in dens with conspecifics. But healthy lobsters will actually avoid dens inhabited by conspecifics that are infected with a deadly virus. In this case, they're not using visual cues, they're using chemical cues, particularly those present in the urine, to detect and avoid infected conspecifics. And it shouldn't surprise us that this strategy in avoiding conspecifics is exactly what we're doing right now. We're all sheltering at home, avoiding members of our own species to protect us against COVID-19.
Okay. So lobsters and humans are not the only social animals that have the ability to detect and avoid sick conspecifics. In fact, this behavior seems to be quite widespread where it's been looked for amongst social animals. So both vertebrates and invertebrates show this ability, and it's likely, this is something we can discuss later, but that this ability really evolved independently in all of these cases. And this is somewhat surprising given that as we are currently experiencing, this social distancing from other members of our species is really costly for social animals. And so many of these animals have evolved the ability to show some degree of nuance in how they apply social distancing. So we're going to give you a few examples of the types of nuance that we can see in the animal kingdom. So the first comes from social insects, which are unusual both in their high degree of relatedness amongst colony members, but also in the way that they sort of divide up reproduction and tasks within the colony, leading some members of the colony to be really the only reproductively valuable members, like the queen and the brood. So Natalie Straymate did some really neat experiments kind of tracking the social behaviors of here's the queen and all of the different types of workers in these common garden ant colonies. And she tracked them before and after she then introduced a fungal pathogen that can be quite deadly into the colony. And in these colonies, the forager ants are really the ones that are the most risky to the whole colony because they're the ones that generally spend the most time outside and are thus most likely to bring germs to the colony. So she specifically focused on the behavior of foragers, but comparing their behavior after the disease was introduced relative to before. And she found here that both the foragers that she specifically applied fungus to, so the treated foragers, as well as the healthy foragers in yellow that did not have any fungus applied to them, spent significantly more time outside the colony once the fungus was introduced. So these sick ants were essentially self-isolating, the ones that are sort of risky to the colony. And then the healthy foragers, because they represent a risky part of the colony, were also essentially self-isolating. And this behavior was seen as well in the distance to the colony. And this wasn't something that all of the ants in the colonies did. So the nurses did not show any change in their behavior, suggesting that this was a specific behavior that the foragers did in response to pathogen introduction. She also looked at this in a network approach. And so here you see the network of the colony before the fungus was introduced and after. And each color represents a different sort of job or role in the colony. So the queen is in purple here. The nurses in green, the foragers are all in yellow, and the foragers that specifically had fungus introduced to them have a little black dot in the middle. The left here is the pre-treatment network. So even though there are black dots in here, those foragers actually haven't gotten fungus applied to them yet. And you can see that here that even before the fungus is introduced, the colony already has a somewhat modular structure, meaning that the foragers are more likely to interact with other foragers, nurses with other nurses, and this is likely a strategy to kind of limit disease spread through the colony, just as sort of a natural constitutive protective behavior. But when the fungus is introduced, this modularity of the colony becomes even stronger. So these foragers, specifically the sick ones, get pushed to the outskirts of the colony or self-isolate to the outskirts in some cases, whereas the nurses kind of close rank almost around the queen, moving farther into the colony and protecting the brood. So another way of sort of showing nuanced social distancing is to protect yourself based on how immunologically vulnerable you are. So Maxine Zeibelberg looked at avoidance of sick conspecifics in house finches using a simple pairwise choice test where focal birds were forced to choose to associate near a sick conspecific or near a healthy conspecific. And she found overall that during kind of peak display of sickness here, the animals in the sample on average showed significant avoidance, meaning they associated most strongly with the healthy conspecific. But there was a huge amount of variation in the degree to which they avoided. And the individuals that showed the strongest avoiders were also those that in blood tests showed the lowest levels of 2 immune markers, which may indicate that in some cases, the individuals that are sort of most immunologically at risk may be the most likely to kind of endure the costs of social distancing because they have the most to gain. Finally, mandrills social distance in a nuanced way by only distancing from non-kin in their group. So the most common direct social interaction in this species is grooming, and they show the ability to avoid grooming the non-kin individuals that have very high protozoal richness. But what's interesting is that when you compare this to very close kin relationships, like maternal half-sibling relationships, offspring mother and mother offspring, they don't show any discrimination or avoidance of infected individuals, which may indicate that some of the very close kin relationships in the species are sufficiently beneficial that they do not distance from those individuals even at some risk of infection. So these are just some of the ways that social distancing can sort of maximize the benefits and minimize the costs. So animals largely only socially distance when they need to by actually detecting sickness either in a conspecific or in the colony at large. They can social distance from those that are most valuable, like the queen, or those that are most vulnerable can social distance themselves the most. And then in some cases, animals seem to not social distance when interactions are particularly beneficial. So some species may kind of take this to the extreme in that they never show social distancing, even in highly social groups where disease is very obvious. So these banded mongooses are a highly social species that lives in large, stable groups. They spend lots of time resting on top of each other and reciprocally grooming each other. And this Botswana study population that Kathy Alexander has established and done a lot of great work in has been subject to this tuberculosis pathogen that causes really visible lesions on the mongooses. So here's some healthy mongooses and some diseased mongooses. And these lesions go on for months, along with behavioral cues that are quite obvious to humans and are likely detectable to other mongooses as well. Nonetheless, former grad student in my lab, Bonnie Fairbanks, found that diseased mongooses were not treated any differently. So there was no social distancing observed. In fact, these diseased mongooses were equally groomed by their healthy troop mates, even though they very rarely reciprocated themselves. And this was surprising because a lot of the grooming in this species seems to be kind of quid pro quo. So social distancing doesn't seem to be favorable for all species, but the ubiquity of it across the animal kingdom more broadly suggests that for a lot of social animals, the benefits of distancing can outweigh the costs. And so this in itself kind of tells us that social distancing works. But I just want to end with kind of a neat example, empirical example of how well it can work. So in that lobster system that Julia first told us about, the lobsters den socially, and most of their denning habitat are these sponges. And there was a big kind of natural experiment that happened in the mid-1990s. This green bar here represents when there was a massive sponge die-off, where almost all of the sponges in the Florida Keys disappeared, leaving the lobsters with very little denning habitat. So the prediction, if lobsters were not able to detect and avoid sick conspecifics, was that the lobsters would all become aggregated in the small amount of remaining denning habitat, and that there would be big outbreaks of this virus, PAV1, shown in the red lines here. So you would see sort of repeated epidemics that would be very devastating to this species. Instead, what they found is that the lobsters were able to use social distancing to prevent this outcome. So their models predicted that in the presence of social distancing, that there would be no outbreaks of the virus. And in fact, that is exactly what they found. So their prevalence predicted by their model was not significantly different from 0. And that's exactly what they saw in the wild. They then did experiments where they essentially added lobsters to denning groups, denning aggregations, and tethered them experimentally, and found that even though the lobsters in these dens really had very few other places to go, if you added a virus-infected lobster to their den, they were much more likely to leave that den and kind of take their chances in the open waters, which is really an incredibly costly behavior of social distancing, but one that worked really, really well at preventing deadly outbreaks in this species. So I really like this example because as I see these predictions of human social distancing during COVID, it reminds me sort of these graphs that the lobsters sort of already demonstrated for us what we need to do, in that even though these are very different species with different viruses, social distancing works whether you're a lobster or a human. So I will end there. And we do have a slide about sort of cues if anyone wants to discuss those, but we can kind of open it up and see where people want to take the conversation.
Great, thanks for that. It looks like we do have one question in the chat box from Charlie. Charlie, if you'd like to go ahead and ask that question to kick the conversation off.
Sure, I was trying to unmute myself to say thanks to Dana and Julia for the great overview. This is fantastic, but I couldn't find the right place to go to in Zoom. But yeah, I had posted a question. I was just wondering, when an individual, I mean, let's imagine it's a mammal, for example, experiences the cues of risk in the environment or from a conspecific, but they can't avoid the contact, right? Either with the environment or with another individual. Maybe it's too risky or costly to do so. Is there any evidence for any kind of enhanced immune responses or defenses that, might get activated in those animals? Does just the perception of the risk interface with the immune system?
I know that there's evidence in humans that the sort of emotion disgust is part of the immune system and it operates using sort of similar mechanisms, but I don't know that anyone's looked at that in animals that I've ever seen.
Yeah, I don't know any specific studies other than yours with the finches, but that's not a species that can't social distance. So.
Yeah, that's a great question, because you would expect that if there were cases where social distancing was not possible, then one would be more inclined to upregulate other types of defenses. It'd be a very interesting study to do. I don't know that, perhaps someone else out there knows of an example.
There are a few people posting. I don't know if anybody else wants to respond to that.
Someone said they release corticosteroids so when they sense a infected conspecific. Is that I'm not sure what the context of that was, but.
So
we do have another, oh, go ahead, Julia, if you want.
Sorry. So I can perhaps address Oscar's question here. Which of the two sexes have or would be expected to have these avoidance mechanisms more developed? The evidence thus far is that women typically have stronger disgust responses than men. I'm not sure that's been shown in animals, but we do know it to be the case in humans. And in fact, it's been suggested that morning sickness is actually just disgust gone into overdrive, because that's a very vulnerable period for the fetus, of course, and it makes sense to avoid anything that could possibly be bad for the fetus, any sort of infectious anything. Much better to err on the side of caution and have a stronger disgust response during pregnancy than to allow infection to occur.
So maybe another reason why there's a general sex difference in prevalence of disease as well, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I laughed when I published that, when I published the 2018 science piece. It was the first paper I had ever published with exclusively female co-authors. And I thought that was perhaps a little bit fitting.
To answer your question, Charlie, Marty did bring up a great example that there are some species that show density dependent prophylaxis in terms of upregulating their immune systems. So that it's slightly different because it's not specifically in response to detecting disease, but it same idea of you might expect when your densities are increasing that you're going to be more at risk. So
yeah, that's good.
Yeah, thanks, Marty.
That's great. That's a good point, Marty.
There's another question. Sorry, go ahead. I'm just looking at the chat. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
I was just going to ask if anybody had their hands up, Meredith. Do you see any hands up, or should we go to the chat box?
No raised hands right now, but just a reminder, you can use the raise hand function if you'd like to actually speak, which we'd love to get you to ask your questions if you're comfortable rather than putting them in the chat, but we'll move to the chat box for now.
So I was going to address this comment here. Is it possible that some of the social prejudices between human populations could be a residue of conspecific avoidance mechanism? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. That has been suggested that cultures that have over evolutionary history dealt with higher risk of parasitism generally have more like collectivism as opposed to individualism, more xenophobia, fear of others, that sort of thing. Certainly we don't promote that. Nevertheless, that it isn't perhaps surprising that that pattern would exist.
And Charlie can probably speak to that in primates. There's good evidence, right, as well that like among troop aggression can be higher in areas with higher rates of parasites. Is that true, Charlie?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I know a little bit about the papers that Julia is referring to in human populations. I think they're quite controversial. I haven't read any of them recently. Enough to really be able to critique them, but I think there's some concerns about the measures of parasite risk that were used and other things. But you know, there's also, you know, it's a plausible hypothesis to investigate. I think so. Meredith, do you see any questions in the chat box we should call out at the moment?
Yeah, so there's a question from Caroline Amoroso pointing out that there's a pretty big difference between social distancing in humans versus animals, and that humans can disseminate this information widely, while animals kind of have to experience it for themselves or undergo selection. So do we know when or if avoidance is learned or innate, and what characteristics of pathogens or hosts might enable evolution of an innate response versus reliance on learning?
There haven't been all that many studies explicitly looking at that, but I know there are some studies in social insects that suggest that individuals that have been primed with exposure to some kind of pathogen are then more likely to exhibit some of these behaviors. So in the case of those studies, it wasn't social distancing per se. I can't remember exactly. I think it was these are cases where they actually care for other forms of what we call social immunity in the social insects, where they would exhibit grooming of infected individuals. So like any sort of defense system, a lot of their behavioral defenses are upregulated in response to exposure to a pathogen. So in a way that kind of, I don't know if you would call that learning, but it's, you know, it's sort of priming, I think of as from an immune perspective. I would suspect that most of the behaviors in animals would be innate, simply because it would make I would think evolution would kind of favor those behaviors as being innate, because you might only have one chance to avoid a deadly pathogen, and if you have to rely on learning, that might not be the best strategy. But I absolutely agree that it's a very different situation for humans today, and we have the ability to not only use testing and other types of cues that animals can't use, but also to disseminate that information widely and to kind of discuss and make decisions based on all sorts of epidemiological predictions. And so you would think we would be really good at social distancing. But
yeah, so I mean, I think it's just amazing. Like if you're an ant living in a colony, you really have to wait for that pathogen to show up on your doorstep to begin that process of social distancing. Whereas, I mean, I modeled the spread of coronavirus through my disease ecology class on January 24th. We knew this thing was coming long before it got here, right? How did we know that? Because we have the technology, we have testing, and we have the internet, and we know that it's coming long before it comes. And that's an enormous evolutionary advantage that is up to us then to either take advantage of it and institute social distancing, or squander that advantage by refusing.
Great.
A slightly different topic, Julia. I've always liked that the paper that you and Sarah and Hillary wrote. Well, the two papers, really, right? The trends in ecology and evolution, and the science piece on the landscape of disgust, you know, which you brought up. And I was just wondering, has anyone ever tried to apply that to humans and modern, you know, societies, thinking about the landscape that we experience on a daily basis? And you could imagine that landscape becomes a lot more peaked at times like this, when we're really aware or have cues, and then it becomes flatter. Are you aware of any efforts to try to? I've thought about that several times, you know, in the last month, in the in the places I go, and how I'm more sensitive to those, you know.
Certainly, I've thought about it, like when you're hiking and you come across a carcass, right? You're going to move away quickly, like that's kind of how an animal might experience the landscape of disgust, or humans and feces. Like if you see a pile of feces, you're probably going to stay away from it. I will say, though, that stay tuned, because Sarah and Hillary and one of Hillary's grad students, Georgia Titcomb, and I have a paper in press at Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, which will cover the consequences of getting rid of disease. So humans, we've existed in this landscape of disgust since over our evolutionary history, right? And we've learned to avoid places that could make us sick, and people that could make us sick, and so on and so forth. When we find solutions to that, when we find treatments, when we alter our niche to get rid of a parasite, all of a sudden you've taken that threat away, and we no longer avoid, right? We no longer have that avoidance behavior. And so there are all kinds of ecological and even conservation consequences of that. So our new paper, which should be out, who knows when, maybe a couple of months, covers the ecological and particularly conservation consequences of solutions. If we're able to eliminate malaria, for example, from the face of the planet, we're going to stop avoiding areas where malaria is a risk, right? And so there's going to be conservation consequences that come along with that.
That's good. Yep, interesting. Do we have any other questions, Meredith? I wanted to shift the topic and hear a little bit about how you guys ended up publishing that piece in the conversation. But if there are any other science-y questions,
Yeah,
first. Maybe we should turn to that, and then.
Yeah, let's get one more question. There's a lot of great discussion in the chat, but one of the questions that's really interesting that hasn't been addressed later in the chat is from Sonia. She says, do high avoiders with low immune markers indicate that they are immune vulnerable and therefore avoid infected individuals, or that their social avoidance was successful and therefore they have minimally activated their immune system? So does the social behavior affect immunity long term, or are these kind of two independent things that complement each other in avoiding infection?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think I would say that the whole behavior disease literature is sort of plagued by this cause and effect challenge. And so in that case of that study, that Houseman study, yeah, we can't really untangle that, I think. To some extent, so that experiment did control for, well, that's a good question. No, I wouldn't really have control for that. Yeah, it can be very difficult to sort of control for that. I think one way you could do it is to take animals when they're fairly young and essentially naive to contact with many pathogens, so such that their immune system should be relatively unaffected by contact. They did use innate markers of immunity there, which you might expect to be a little less dependent on exposure levels in the wild. But it's a big issue, is what do these correlations mean? And so we're certainly kind of telling one story with them, but there are lots of other stories that could be told with them. And so lots of great questions to ask for future studies.
I was curious on that ant study that was in your slide deck, Dana, with the increased modularity. Did the authors then go on to test whether that influenced disease transmission and protected the queen?
Yeah.
And,
well, they were able to show that at the end of these kind of experimental outbreaks, all the queens were still alive. I think they had 11 total colonies. All the queens and most of the nurses were still alive. The challenge is they can't make the ants not socially distant. So there wasn't a treatment where they, introduced disease and then.
Yeah. I was wondering if they modeled it, with a simulation or
yes.
estimate R0 or something like that. I was just on this talk that Erin Mordecai was giving. I don't know if you saw that she was giving a talk on the Midas Network, and she had a model where she was showing how the social distancing in Santa Clara County reduced R0. And I was just wondering if the people who did the work with the ants had done something similar to show that it actually had effects on disease transmission.
They did. They did a model initially just for the starting network and showed that so relative to like a random network, they showed both that the way that the colony interacts just constitutively protects it from disease spread through the network, and then they also showed that the behavioral changes protect it even further. Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty amazing.
Okay. Well, I was just curious, just to wrap things up, how you ended up publishing that piece on the conversation, and if you published there before, how you heard about it, and whether you thought that was effective in reaching the public. I don't know which one of you was the one who initiated that, but.
Yeah, I can start. I initiated it, and I have to say I had never heard of the conversation before the interaction that I had, but a colleague recommended it to me because I had mentioned that I, like many people, had a lot of trouble focusing during the early days of the COVID outbreak, and for some reason I felt like the one thing I could really write was something about social distancing in animals. It was sort of this creative outlet that I just felt like had to come out, and it was somehow cathartic for my brain. And so I was looking at places to kind of send it and reached out to Julia, and a colleague here at Virginia Tech had just had a great experience with the conversation. And I wish we had honestly started with them. We tried a few other places directly first, like the Washington Post in terms of an op-ed. But we had such a great experience with the conversation. I would highly recommend them. They worked with us as I really liked that they're very evidence-based, and so you can actually include citations on like an op-ed to a newspaper, and then they're really a gateway. I didn't realize when we first worked with them that they then distribute that article to all of these other places, and they have so many connections that I think that got the article a lot more reach ultimately than it would have if we had gone straight to somewhere like the Washington Post successfully.
At last count, when I looked last at my dashboard on the conversation, it looked like that piece had been read by somewhere around 70,000 people. So I think we reached the public fairly well with it. It seems like we knew we were writing it at a time when the topic was going to be very hot, and hoped that would help it, give it some legs.
Yeah. I see Marty just posted that Medium is a great outlet for this, much like the conversation. I don't know, Marty, do you have anything? If you have good audio, do you want to weigh in on this at all and share that?
There's not too much to say. My lab and I put something out 3 or 4 weeks ago on stress. Everybody's thinking and experiencing the stress of social distancing and everything else with this epidemic, but the implications of stress for how the immune system works wasn't getting as much treatment as, the entire field of psychoneuroimmunology might suggest that it should. So we put something together there, and it was super easy to get in, and it didn't get nearly the attention of what Dana and Julia's did, but it was a lot of fun, and it was, motivated by the same thing Dana was talking about. It's just what else can we do, and how can we cope with this brand new situation? So really easy.
Great, thanks, Marty. Does anyone else want to weigh in or ask any questions about that in terms of the outreach side of this? It looks like at least Melissa. It looks like Melissa has a hand raised. Is it related to this, Melissa? Please weigh in if so.
Yeah, a quick follow-up question to your question, Charlie. I was just curious if you are able to actually capture any data on who's reading these types of articles. I mean, I imagine, if it's just a link you click on, you have no idea who's on the other end, but I was wondering if people can subscribe, or there's any way to track, like, are they coming from a university email, or it seems to be someone outside of academia?
I have no way of tracking that, except based on the comments, I'm going to say deniers.
Yeah, we did have a few interesting comments.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think we should get some evolutionary medicine articles up on the conversation. So
yeah.
Let's put in some work.
We got some really interesting kind of follow-up contacts there. One was an active online learning center for kids wrote a version for kids, which has gotten a lot of classroom use. So that was really fun to reach sort of some of the younger audiences too.
Okay. Any other questions or comments or follow-ups?
There's been so many in the chat, I'm having trouble keeping. If anybody who put something in the chat wants to say so, unmute yourself and
yeah, lots of great points and questions.
take the question.
And yes, a shout out to Robert May, absolutely. Very sad.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think we should probably wrap things up. Thank you very much, Julia and Dana. This was really interesting and fantastic, and I think sparked a very productive conversation, and maybe it will lead to some more conversation pieces. The conversation, at least we called some attention to that venue. And I do think it's important for us to try to communicate these perspectives more widely to the public, and I think they're thirsty for that perspective. So absolutely. It's really great.
The conversation is really good at working with academics who are not the best at translating their work. So I would really encourage working with them. I learned a lot from their experience. So. And
in addition, one of the things that I think has really come to the forefront for me in this pandemic is that there's so many aspects of this that well-informed experts from a lot of different fields probably have something to say here. It is not just the epidemiologists to have something to contribute. Dana and I both call ourselves disease ecologists, but in addition, there's probably a role for the data scientists to say something, and for the immunologists, of course, to be saying something. And a lot of folks, there's been a lot of discussion over the past few weeks about sort of armchair epidemiology, and people who without expertise shouldn't be jumping in to the conversation. I guess my opinion is that science needs to take into account all voices, and if then somebody is reaching beyond their expertise, then of course they will be called out for a model that that isn't realistic or what have you. But I do think there is a place for the voice of people with a lot of different kinds of expertise right now.
Yeah, definitely.
As long as it's actual scientific expertise, right?
That's right.
It's a hard line to draw sometimes.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's thank Julia and Dana for leading us on this great conversation. And Meredith, do you want to say something before we depart? When's our next one? It's Alfonso Troisi, right? And
yes, so the next Club EvMed is going to be next Thursday, May 7th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And that's going to be with Alfonso Troisi of the University of Rome Tor Vergata School of Medicine. And his topic is the behavioral immune system and fear of COVID-19. So it should dovetail really nicely with what we talked about today, and focusing it even more on the current pandemic.
And we have a number of other speakers getting lined up. We're going to hear from Sean Carroll in the not too distant future. I believe that's set now. And also Athena Tepis. And so we are going to start moving off of into some topics that are not necessarily COVID-19 related. So stay tuned and join our listserv, and we hope to see you guys again in the future. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.